Hi guys, what's up? My name is Aayush Ailawadi and today we're about to talk about something that you've wanted for a long time. Perhaps it was the iPhone 10. We've covered it extensively on Bloomberg Quint. But today it's a different story. Well, yesterday actually, yesterday was the day when the Financial Times broke a story which establishes that your iPhone 10 could perhaps be assembled by illegal student labor in China. Apple has found that its main supplier in Asia has been employing high school students working illegally overtime to assemble its new model phone, that's the iPhone 10. Now, Apple has confirmed that interns at a factory operated by Honhai Precision Industry, which is part of the Foxconn group, worked overtime. Now, the Financial Times report actually talks about a group of 3,000 students, all between the ages of 17 and 19, who actually sent to work at the local facility. Now, Apple has said that they took prompt action when they found some students were allowed to work overtime. The students worked at the factory as part of a mandatory 3-month work experience. 6 students confirmed that they worked 11 hours a day, which is overtime for student interns under Chinese law. Just to understand all of this and what this means for Apple and what this story was all about, just to get to the heart of it, we're actually joined by Yuan, who wrote that piece and broke this piece from China. Yuan, I really appreciate you joining us at this time of the night. We're very glad that you could join us. It's a fantastic piece. What I want to start off by asking you is, you worked on this piece as an investigative report for nearly a month. What was it like actually visiting that facility in Zhengzhou? And also, we're also joined, of course, by Michael Kumar. He is from a Hong Kong-based NGO. We're going to get to Michael as well. Thanks so much for joining us at this hour as well, Michael. Yuan, I want to start by asking you what your experience was like reporting on this, visiting that facility, and what kind of insights you actually gained.
Yeah. So before I went to the Foxconn plant, which makes a large majority of Apple's iPhones in the Chinese city of Zhengzhou, I'd heard about the theme of factories turning to student labor as a source of flexible labor. And especially when demand is high, there's even more pressure to cut corners and to break labor laws. And so this is a theme that I had already had in mind. I was told by a source that Foxconn in Zhengzhou was doing this as well. So I went with the intention of looking for student interns. And on the first morning that I went to the plant, I had no idea what the security would be like, because Foxconn plants in other places that I've also visited have had incredibly tight security. I wasn't sure I'd be able to get in there, but speaking to a few other contacts who had been, it seemed like there could be at least some chance to speak to workers at the factory gates. So when I arrived, I was just very relieved that I was able to pass in to the gates and not be prevented by security. That was the first feeling of achievement. So then the factory itself is a huge campus. It took me about half an hour to walk just from one end to the other. And there are, at this time, about somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 workers on the whole campus. So it's teeming with people, especially when the lunch shift starts and finishes. And that's when I managed to find student interns who were there to speak to.
Right, yeah, and you know, but also this entire month that you were actually investigating and working on this story, after you did actually come up with this piece, did Apple get in touch? Because Apple's put out a statement as well. What kind of implications do you think this has for tech companies like Apple, who use a lot of these manufacturing facilities in China? I know in Zhengzhou, in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, there's a lot of these industrial zones and manufacturing facilities that are, well, Foxconn actually has, has facilities here in India as well. What I want to understand from you is what are the implications of something like this, considering that, is this a one-off case? Is this a singular instance, an isolated instance, or is this something which is perhaps part of a much bigger problem?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, and today we did a follow-up piece looking at how widespread this is across China. And you're right, Foxconn is a big example of this. It's estimated to be the biggest user of student interns, but not the only one. It's simply the most prominent one. As Michael can describe, there are other NGOs who found that other multinationals have used other Chinese suppliers who've misused, who have labour practices that have misused student interns in China. So I think the broader problem here is not just of these, just not just of Apple, not just of Foxconn. Those are just the most high-profile cases. There's a NGO in Beijing which looks at children's rights, which found that 58% of the factories in electronics that they'd surveyed were using student interns. The textiles industry is also a really big offender in this case. And now, just to be clear, student interns are not in themselves illegal in China, and there have been some instances where interns at Foxconn or other plants were doing work experience that was relevant to their course because they were studying electronics or they were studying something to do with factory management. But the big problem here, I think, is that the students are sent, the students in this case are in Zhengzhou who are interviewed were sent to the plant doing things completely irrelevant to their major, and in fact doing very menial, repetitive work. One woman told me that she was assembling iPhone X cameras. So this is something that she did every 30 seconds, just repeatedly for up to more than 1,000 times a day. So it's repetitive, menial work that doesn't teach them anything that they can use in the programs of study that they're actually engaging in.
Right, Yuan.
So the school making that compulsory
right.
is a problem from the point of view of education.
Right, that's an interesting point you brought up, because also in your piece you also mentioned that students have also come from nearby cities of Kaifeng, Nanyang, and Xinjiang, if I got those names correctly. But that seems to point at a much larger problem, and that's what I want to get Michael's insights as well. Michael, when it comes to the labor laws in China, so what was happening at this Foxconn facility, it was illegal per se.
Yeah, well, technically, the student intern laborers are not considered as, regular workers, so they are not protected by the Chinese labor law. But instead, the Chinese government has introduced a provision protecting this kind of student workers that clearly state that the students should be working in the factory or in the company that are related to their major. And also the provision clearly stated that the students should not be working overtime or should not be working night shifts, or they should not be arranged, in a risky position with, dangerous tasks or equipments. But obviously, in in Yang Yuan's investigation and also in our investigation, we found that a lot of factories, Apple suppliers are using student intern violating this provision. So the problem is like this.
Right, Michael, and also what I want to understand was that if this is a much bigger problem, what's actually being done by the administration there to really stop student labor from getting exploited in the future? Because they're 17 to 19-year-olds. Perhaps they're unaware of the repercussions and the ramifications of something like this. Is there any sort of a system in place to prevent something like this happening yet again?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the provision was actually introduced by the Chinese Education Department. This is central policy, but we often observe that, in the local government level, a lot of local governments are competing for this factory to locate into their region, so they would allow or they would have a less, control or less monitoring on this kind of condition. Or in some cases, we know that the governments even offer a lot of taxation reduction and also a lot of convenience and well-being to these factories in order to attract them to locate in their region, in order to boost the local region's GDP. So you can understand that the governments are sort of allowing this kind of issue to happen.
That's shocking, Michael. But Yuan, another thing I wanted to understand from you, Yuan, is that while you were covering this piece, it's interesting because you have spoken to a lot of people as well, and I can considering this is something I've been tracking as well. Now the iPhone 10, this was a special year for Apple as well. A lot of pressure on them to really deliver with the iPhone 10, because this is the first time that they've broken away from their traditional form factor. But the iPhone 8 came as well, the 8 Plus, and then there was talk of the iPhone 10 not coming to market in time as well. It was actually postponed to November. There was supposed to be a supply problem as well. do you think all of these sort of business practices could have led to something like this? Considering that they actually employed a lot more labor, Yuan.
Yes, absolutely. That's you've hit the nail on the head there, because what I heard from workers at the factory, both the students and also the people who are managing other workers, is that there was an extra strong need for flexible labor this year. So every year there's a need for seasonal labor, which comes from August to the end of the year with a new iPhone coming online. And this year is particularly difficult because of the supplier delays that you just referred to. And so production at the Foxconn plant of the new iPhone, the iPhone X, was delayed until about September. And in September, that's when the local government of the province that covers Zhengzhou and its neighboring cities issued a notice to local vocational schools telling them to send their work experience students to Foxconn as a way of bridging this gap. And that's just one of the preferential policies that Michael referred to just then, of local governments also being part of the problem of exploitation of students, because they want to keep their biggest business, be it the Foxconn-Apple partnership, in town. And so they actively support it by supplying flexible labor. And when there's no flexible labor to be found on the formal labor market, they turn to the schools.
Yuan, there's another thing I wanted to ask you. I mean, considering this is Apple, one of the world's biggest tech companies, perhaps, they do attract a lot of attention, but there's a lot of top smartphone manufacturers all over China, be it the likes of Huawei, with the Honor series, Xiaomi is doing really well. It's a very popular brand here in India, and a host of them who actually come up with phones. Do you think, considering that you covered this for the past month, that there's a lot of attention on this particular case, considering it's Apple, while perhaps there are other companies and other foreign companies as well, which could be manufacturing in China and sort of violating some of these rules?
Yeah, no, I completely see your point, and I think that is right. Foxconn don't only supply Apple, they also supply other international brands like Samsung. Of course, in China, there's also the domestic smartphone brands like Huawei, like Xiaomi. And I'm sure that there are plenty of secrets that can be dug out if we were to dig into their phones. I think the reason for looking into Apple is twofold. One is because of the way that Apple releases iPhones, and it's on an annual cycle. There's a lot of pressure at some certain time of year, and often, with its increasingly new innovations to smartphones, that means suppliers often don't know what they're doing until it's very soon, until the orders are due, and so they're under a lot of pressure now from Apple. That's the kind of pressure, and that's the kind of just-in-time production that means that Apple is particularly at risk of suppliers turning to exploiting student labor. And I think the second reason why Apple is interesting to look at here is because they have a big corporate social responsibility program in China. In fact, they have done lots of work with vocational schools in Henan. And so there's definitely a lot of effort from Apple to talk the talk. And I think as journalists, we also need to make sure that Apple walks the walk as well.
Absolutely. And another thing a question I wanted to pose to Michael was, Michael, what Apple seems to say is that all of this student overtime was voluntary, right? This was something that, based on Yuan's piece, a couple of people that she's interviewed have actually said that we're being forced by our school to work here. That's what Ms. Yang said, an 18-year-old student training to be a train attendant who, declined to use her first name for fear of punishment. But Michael, the fact that, Apple and the companies maintain that this is voluntary, does that make it make it a lesser of a problem, or perhaps show any less disregard for the law?
Yeah, so we have actually interviewed a lot of students that have been working in Apple's production line as student intern labor. So we found that a lot of students reported that if they refuse to work, the internship or to work according to the requirements of the factory, they will not be able to graduate from the school, or their subsidies of the food subsidies or the accommodation subsidies in school will be cut. So you can imagine, like, if they refuse to work overtime or if they refuse to work as internship, they will have some consequences that they have to face. So we don't think this is a voluntary work under the circumstances. And also, we know that a lot of workers, including student workers and regular workers, they're receiving extremely low basic wage, meaning that if they don't work overtime for that overtime subsidies, they will not be able to sustain their life. So we don't think this is voluntary. It is like under the systematic force of low wage, and also the specifically those students, they are facing consequences of not being able to graduate if they refuse to work.
I know, absolutely. And also, since this does put the focus on some of these manufacturing units and workers in these manufacturing units, what I want to understand from you, Michael, is that it seems that there have been some sort of improvements in some of these factories also. So we got to point out some of them as well. Some of them these companies require factories to buy social insurance for all workers. Is that something that's being adhered to in these manufacturing units, especially for iPhone Xs?
Yes, so we can see that talking about the social insurance, this is actually legally required by the Chinese labor law. And this is, the students' intern labors are not covered by these social insurance schemes. So no insurance for any student workers in Foxconn or in other Apple manufacturers. But for those regular workers, yes, there are more and more factories buying this social insurance to, for the workers in factory. But we can see that a lot of factories are not paying the correct rate of insurance for their workers, which is violating the law as well. So we can see that the situation is getting, a little bit better, but still not fulfilling the law and, official requirements.
Right, Michael. Yuan, since you did work on this piece for the past 1 month, something I wanted to ask you was that, very, very honestly, was it very difficult for you to actually work on a piece like this, considering, it's one of the world's most valuable companies and one of the biggest tech giants out there? What was it like working on this piece for the past 1 month?
I think the biggest consideration for me in starting working on this piece is how to speak to sources in a discreet manner. Because if you send nearly all communications in China on the internet or by phone or by text are monitored by the government. And certain issues are very politically sensitive here. Human rights, workers' rights, anything that might conflict with the government's own agenda. So the biggest concern in reporting this story, as with many investigative stories that I do in China, is keeping sources safe in China. That leads to a lot of worry, as I'm sure you can imagine, for both me and often for the people that I'm speaking to. So I think that's the toughest thing to start off with. There's actually a rich field of NGOs, of academics doing work on this in China, because vocational schooling has become a very big issue for China. It's become a priority area for the government to improve on, because the government knows that it needs to upgrade its education system if it wants to stay competitive in the global economy. It knows that current vocational schooling quality is very poor. So there is a great wealth of academics doing really, really interesting work out there on issues around.
Right, Yuan. In
terms of doing the background investigation, that's there. I think in terms of actually getting sources really close to the situation, in the factory or in the local government, people who can tell you the inside story on this is always difficult. And it's especially difficult in China because of the political control that the government exerts.
No, absolutely, Yuan. I think it's incredible work that you've done. One, considering that it's such a big tech giant that you were talking about in the story, and two, considering this was all done in China. Hats off to you for your journalistic work. And Michael, thanks so much for joining us from Hong Kong. Yuan, thanks so much for making this happen as well. And all of you tuning in, this was a piece that we had to get you. We were always talking about whether you'll get the iPhone 10 in time, whether you'll actually be able to afford it, considering how expensive it was, the grey market associated with the phone, who will review it first, and all that rush. But let's pause, take a breath, and actually figure out where that iPhone 10 is coming from and how it's actually being manufactured. Well, but thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned to Bloomberg Quint for more updates.